Welcome to another Phil UK Net lens review, and today's lens is the Canon EFS 10-22mm f3.5 to f4.5. And like the last lens I reviewed, the Canon f400 5.6, it wasn't a lens that I intended buying, but there are different reasons. With the 400 f5.6 I bought it because I'd had lots of problems with the 300 f4. With this one, when I first moved into a DSLR system, I made a decision to only buy EF full frame L lenses, but that decision was rather limiting. I had a 17-40 f4L, but because I've only ever used APS-C cameras with a 1.6 crop factor, the wide end isn't 17, it's more like 28, which isn't actually very wide. I wanted something wider, and at the time this was the only option. But since I bought it, it's actually turned into one of my favourite lenses. So I think the story there is that don't be silly and make very rigid decisions, because it limits you. There are some very good EFS lenses and there are some very good EF non-L lenses. So in today's review, what I'll be doing, I'll be taking a closer look at the lens, then I'll be looking at how to use an ultra wide angle lens, then looking at image quality, some sample images, and finally I'll tell you if I recommend buying this lens or not. The length of the lens is 90mm and the maximum diameter is 84mm. The weight is 13.6 ounces or 385 grams. The front filter diameter is 77mm. Inside there are 13 lens elements in 10 groups, and there is a 6-blade diaphragm. But you don't need to worry too much about bokeh quality with these ultra wide angle lenses because the depth of field is so deep. Bokeh is really more important with longer lenses. The autofocus mechanism is driven by an ultrasonic motor, and I've always found it to be accurate and fairly fast, although I don't tend to photograph fast moving objects with this lens. On the outside there's a switch to switch between autofocus and manual focus, and a distance gauge. A soft case is available, which I don't have, and a lens hood is available, which I do have. This is the same lens hood as used on the 17-40L. I've never really found much benefit with using lens hoods, perhaps it's just me. One small anomaly is that I bought the 10-22 after buying the 17-40L, and on the 17-40 the zoom ring is at the back and the focus ring is at the front, and on the 10-22 it's the other way around, so the zoom ring is at the front and the focus ring is at the back, but it's not really a big problem. The image quality of the EFS 10-22 is excellent. It may not have a red ring around the barrel, but the image quality is as good as most L lenses. In 2013 I moved to a Canon EOS M mirrorless system, which I still use, and I bought the Canon EF-M 11-22. When I did my initial testing, the obvious lens to compare against was this one, and I wasn't actually expecting any noticeable differences in image quality. And if there had been differences, I thought this one would probably have been better because it's a newer design, newer lens coatings, etc. What really surprised me when I looked at the images on my computer was how much better the images looked from this lens. Sharpness was about the same, but the contrast and colour saturation was just so much better with this lens. When you looked at clouds in the sky and just looked at the scene in general, everything just looked better with this lens. A couple of years ago I had a trip to Hoi An in Vietnam, and I wanted to travel as lightly as possible, so it made sense to take this lens. But in the end I decided to take this lens just because I prefer the image quality so much. All lenses have optical imperfections, this one's no exception, and those imperfections will be exaggerated with ultra wide angle lenses. You'll see vignetting, and any tall structures will look like the Leaning Tower of Pisa. But it's not really such a big problem. The vignetting only appears when you photograph very bright subjects, such as the sky, and it's quite easy to remove. Many cameras these days have inbuilt firmware that will remove it, or you can remove it in post-processing. With perspective, it's quite easy to straighten up vertical lines. If I do that, I use the lens filter in Photoshop. But quite often, the effect straight out of the camera looks quite good, and I don't bother straightening up the vertical lines. These problems always look far worse when you photograph test charts and line grids. So this is why I don't photograph those things for my reviews. I just stick to real life photos. What do you use ultra wide angle lenses for? And with a wide angle lens you get a lot of the scene in the photo, so they can be very useful for doing photos in confined spaces. For example, if you're selling a house and you're taking interior photos, they're great. The trouble with that kind of photography, where you just stand back and get a lot in the scene, is that the photos can be quite boring because there's no subject, and you still need a subject to draw the attention of the viewer's eye into the photo. What I find makes the biggest difference is the depth of field. With longer lenses and big apertures, you isolate your subject. So you focus on the subject and the background just becomes blurred, so all you see is the subject. The wide angle lenses have a very deep depth of field, so when you focus on your subject, the background is still in focus. So what you need to do is just pay a bit more attention to your composition, knowing that the subject and the background is going to be in focus, and use the two elements together to make your photo. Hopefully I've achieved this with some of the sample images that you'll see later in this video. Finally, would I recommend buying this lens? And whenever I try to answer that question, I always ask myself, if for some reason I no longer had the lens, would I buy it again? And there are several factors involved. Firstly, there's performance. Was I pleased with the results from the lens? And yes, I've always been very pleased with the images taken with this lens. Secondly, has anything new come along since it was released? And what about price? If a new lens comes out that is significantly better and only slightly more expensive, it obviously makes sense to buy the new lens. If the new lens only offers a small improvement in performance and it's 2 or 3 times as expensive, you might still want to consider the old lens. But nothing like that applies to this lens. The only lens to have come along since this one is the EFS 10-18 f4.5 to f5.6. The zoom range is smaller and it's slower and it's lower quality. The only advantage is it's about half the price. It retails for about $280 and this one's about $600. And the only other consideration is whether in the future you plan to move to a full frame system. This being EFS, obviously you can only use it on APS-C cameras, you can't use it on a full frame system. So if you're planning to move to full frame, then you won't be able to use this lens. But if you're just planning to stick to APS-C, then yes, it's certainly a lens that I would highly recommend. As ever, I hope this has been useful. If it has been useful, please consider subscribing to my channel, and please come back soon to watch more videos.